Power is often judged too early, too quickly, too confidently, because people tend to believe what they can see. Strength, movement, presence, things that are visible, become the measure of what is possible. And anything that does not match that expectation is dismissed, ignored, overlooked. This is how mistakes begin, not through lack of intelligence, but through certainty. The certainty that what is seen is all that exists. This is where his story begins. Not with power, not with strength, but with limitation. A limitation that defined how others saw him, how they spoke about him, how they dismissed him, because he did not fit the image of what a future ruler should be. He did not move like one. He did not appear strong. He did not command attention. And in a world where perception shapes reality, that was enough. Enough to be underestimated. Enough to be ignored. Enough to be forgotten. But what is often forgotten is that growth does not always happen where people are looking. Sometimes it happens in silence, away from expectation, away from pressure, away from the need to perform. And in that silence, something begins to form, not quickly, not dramatically, but steadily. Because when there is no expectation, there is no limitation, no pressure to meet a standard, no need to prove anything immediately, only time to observe, to understand, to learn.
Because while others are focused on what is visible, he is focused on what is not. Patterns, behavior, movement, the structure of power itself. Because power is not just strength, it is positioning, timing, awareness, the ability to act at the right moment, in the right way. And that requires understanding, deep understanding, the kind that is built over time, quietly, without attention, without recognition. And that becomes an advantage, because no one prepares for what they do not expect. No one defends against what they do not see. And that creates an opening, not immediately, but eventually, because time changes things. It changes perception. It changes circumstances. It creates moments where what was once ignored becomes relevant. This is the turning point, not when he becomes strong, but when strength becomes necessary, when the environment shifts, when the system that once ignored him needs something it cannot easily produce: leadership, direction, clarity. And suddenly, the overlooked becomes important, because he has something others do not just strength, but perspective, understanding built over time, without distraction, without assumption. And when that understanding is applied, it creates impact, immediate, noticeable, because it is not based on reaction, but on preparation, on patterns already studied, on decisions already considered. This is where perception begins to change, slowly, at first, then more rapidly. Because results are difficult to ignore, and once results appear, attention follows, respect follows, even from those who once dismissed. But by that point, it is no longer about proving anything, because the system has already shifted. Power has begun to move, not through force alone, but through structure, through decisions that shape outcomes, through actions that influence direction. And once that movement begins, it becomes difficult to stop, because momentum builds, not just externally, but internally. Confidence grows, not from ego, but from clarity, from knowing how things work, from understanding how to act. And that is what creates dominance, not just strength, but certainty, the certainty of action, of timing, of execution. Because when decisions are made from understanding, they are more effective, more precise, more impactful. And that creates advantage, sustained advantage, which leads to expansion. Not chaotic expansion, but controlled, strategic, purposeful. Because power that grows without structure does not last, but power built on understanding can adapt, can respond, can evolve. And that is what defines long-term success. Not the moment of rise, but the ability to maintain direction, to adjust when needed, to recognize when change is required. Because no system remains static. Everything shifts, conditions change, new challenges appear, and only systems that can adapt, continue to lead. This is where legacy is formed, not just through what is built, but through what continues, through the structures that remain, through the influence that extends beyond the individual. Because true power is not temporary. It leaves something behind, a shift, a change, a new understanding of what is possible. And that is what makes this story significant, not just because he rose, but because of how he rose, from a position that was dismissed, ignored, overlooked, and transformed it into something that could not be ignored. A reminder that perception is not reality, that weakness is not always what it seems, and that sometimes the greatest mistake is underestimating what you do not understand. History often remembers outcomes, victories, empires, leaders, but it rarely pauses long enough to examine the process behind them, the quiet moments, the overlooked stages, the parts of the story that did not look important at the time, because significance is usually recognized after impact, not before. And that is what makes this story different, because everything that made it powerful was invisible at the beginning. There was no early dominance, no immediate strength, no clear sign of what was coming. Only limitation, only doubt, only a version of reality that seemed complete, but was not. Because what people saw was not the full picture, and that is where the first lesson begins. Perception is not reality, it is interpretation, a simplified version of what exists, filtered through expectation, through bias, through experience. And once that interpretation is formed, it becomes difficult to change, because people do not just observe reality, they defend their understanding of it, they reinforce it, they build confidence around it, and that confidence can become a weakness, because when you are certain, you stop questioning. When you stop questioning, you stop seeing, and when you stop seeing, you miss what is changing, quietly, gradually, right in front of you. This is exactly what happened, not just to individuals, but to the system itself, because systems are built on assumptions. Assumptions about how power works, who holds it, who deserves it, who is capable of rising. And once those assumptions are accepted, they become rules, unwritten, but powerful. And anyone who does not fit those rules is excluded from consideration, not always intentionally, but consistently. That exclusion creates space, a different kind of space, a space without pressure, without expectation, without constant observation. And in that space, growth can happen differently, not rushed, not forced, not shaped by external validation, but guided internally, by curiosity, by awareness, by the need to understand. And that kind of growth is often stronger, because it is not built for appearance. It is built for function, for effectiveness, for real-world application. This is why the transformation was so powerful, because it was not sudden, it was not accidental, it was prepared, layer by layer, moment by moment, decision by decision. And by the time it became visible, it was already complete, already structured, already capable. That is why it could not be stopped easily, because what people saw as a sudden rise was actually a delayed recognition of something that had been developing for a long time. This is the danger of underestimation. It delays response. It creates hesitation. It allows momentum to build without resistance. And momentum is one of the most powerful forces in any system, because once it begins, it feeds itself. Success creates confidence. Confidence creates action. Action creates more success. And that cycle continues, expanding, strengthening, stabilizing, until it becomes the new reality. But this is where the deeper lesson exists. Because the story is not just about rise. It is about structure. Power alone is not enough. Strength alone is not enough. Even success alone is not enough. What matters is how those things are organized, how they are directed, how they are sustained. Because without structure, power collapses. Without direction, strength becomes scattered. Without purpose, success becomes temporary. This is why his legacy lasted. Not because he rose, but because he built something that could continue. A system, a structure, a way of operating that extended beyond the individual. And that is the difference between influence and legacy. Influence is immediate. It affects the present. It shapes current outcomes. Legacy is extended. It affects the future. It shapes what comes next. And that requires a different level of thinking, a different level of intention. It requires looking beyond the moment, beyond the current victory, beyond the immediate result, and asking a deeper question. What will remain when I am no longer here? Because that is what defines true power. Not control, not dominance, but continuity. The ability to create something that does not depend entirely on you, that continues to function, to influence, to exist, even in your absence. And that is what makes this story significant, because it challenges a common belief. That power is about visibility, about recognition, about immediate impact. But this story shows something different. That power can begin in silence, in obscurity, in places where no one is paying attention, and that those beginnings do not limit the outcome. In fact, they can strengthen it, because when growth is not rushed, it becomes stable. When understanding is deep, it becomes reliable. And when action is based on clarity, it becomes effective. This is what created the shift, not just in his life, but in the system around him. Because once a new path is proven possible, it cannot be ignored. It becomes an option, a reference point, a new standard, and that changes everything. Because it expands what people believe is achievable. And belief is one of the most powerful forces in history. It shapes decisions. It influences behavior. It determines what people attempt and what they avoid. And when belief expands, so does possibility. This is why stories like this matter, not just as history, but as perspective, as a reminder that reality is not fixed, that systems can change, that expectations can be challenged, and that sometimes the greatest potential exists in places no one is looking. This is the final lesson. Do not rely only on what is visible. Do not define limits based on appearance. Do not assume understanding is complete, because what you see is only part of what exists, and what you do not see may be what changes everything. That is the story, not just of a boy who was underestimated, but of a system that failed to see clearly, and of a transformation that proved something deeper. That weakness is not always weakness. That silence is not always absence. That obscurity is not always limitation. And that sometimes the most powerful force is the one no one prepared for.